Right, well, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for taking the time to come and see me speak today and for inviting me to MGIMO. Over the course of my academic career, I've had the opportunity to encounter a number of students from MGIMO at the LSE, at the University of Surrey, and now at Royal Holloway. And they've always been very impressive and very engaging students. So it really is a privilege for me to be able to come here today and talk to you about my research interests, in particular on European security and defence. Now, I'd like to begin today's presentation by giving you a little bit of context about the research that I'm engaged in and the background to my research. And of course, like any good academic, I'm also going to plug my latest publications, which you'll see up there on the screen. Now, the origins of the research questions that I'm engaging with today are in the time that I spent as an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow, as a guest of the German government, out in Berlin between 2009 and 2011. And during this time, I was working on a project that was looking at defence reform in post-Cold War Europe. And in particular, I was interested in engaging with the question of the extent to which European states had undertaken an emulation of the capabilities, doctrines, and force structures that were associated with the US-led revolution in military affairs, and in the question of the extent of European convergence in defence policy. Convergence of the West European great powers, of Britain, France, and Germany. And so this project inevitably had quite a broad remit. It was looking at changes to military force structures, to military capabilities, to military doctrine. But it was also looking at the embeddedness of European states' defence policies within the institutional architecture of European defence cooperation, within NATO, in the transatlantic defence community, and at the European level, in the European Union's common security and defence policy, as well as a range of bi- and plurilateral defence arrangements that have arisen in Europe over the post-Cold War period. And there's a number of these that exist, force generation and capability procurement projects outside of the auspices of NATO and the European Union. And theoretically, I was trying to understand European convergence and differentiation by using a theoretical model that's called neoclassical realism. Now, as students and scholars of international relations, I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Kenneth Waltz on neo-realist theory. And in that project, I suppose I started with a bit of a bias, in the sense that I believed that the neo section of neoclassical realism would only carry a certain amount of analytical weight. Neoclassical realism is a theory that argues that the systemic distribution of capabilities in the international system is the main driver of change in the area of defence and security. The classical element of neoclassical realism comes in terms of understanding differentiation in that convergence. And I thought the classical element of neoclassical realist theory would carry a good deal of analytical leverage in understanding differentiation. And I realized when I was undertaking this project that I was mistaken about the level of analytical leverage one could get from this systemic level of analysis. It was much greater than I'd initially anticipated. Now, there wasn't time to explore this in great depth in the book on neoclassical realism that you see here to the left-hand side. And so that led me to the next project that was looking at European defence cooperation. And in particular, it was an opportunity, I think, to explore, and I wrote this with a colleague from the Department of Law at the School of, the University of Surrey, to explore the insights that an analysis of European law could give to the variety of theoretical approaches that have been used to understand European defence cooperation over the post-Cold War period. And it's some of the empirical, and particularly theoretical insights that come out of this book that I'd like to talk to you about today. Now, I'm going to begin with the empirical context of what we're looking at here. The post-Cold War era has witnessed a significant level of progress in the ability of European states to develop military autonomy from the United States, to begin a process of decoupling from NATO Now, the extent of this progress, I suppose, is dependent on the kind of person you are. If you're a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of person. I suppose as a realist, I would to some extent, I suppose, be a glass half full person in that I'm quite sceptical about the extent to which states can begin to pool their military resources and capabilities at an international level. But certainly, if we look at the more optimistic side of the debate, in terms of assessing the empirical evidence, we can see some notable progress in European defence in terms of establishing a collective capability to deal with security challenges within Europe's geopolitical neighbourhood over the post-Cold War period. Since the establishment of the European Union's Common Security and Defence Policy in 1999, we've seen a significant augmentation and development of the institutional architecture associated with European defence. Of course, the establishment of the Political and Security Committee at the EU level, the EU military staff, the European Defence Agency that acts as a mechanism for European states to begin to consider how they can pool and share capabilities and for coordinating common defence procurement initiatives. There have been a range of capability procurement and force generation initiatives that have taken place over the post-Cold War era under the auspices of CSDP. And these, of course, include initiatives like the Galileo satellite navigation system that will allow the Europeans to decouple their C4ISR, their intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, from those of the Americans. And of course, the development of Galileo has been touted as a civilian system, but it has its roots very firmly in the realization of the Europeans in the Kosovo conflict of 1999 that they were heavily dependent on the United States for things like updates on their precision-guided munitions. The Europeans have also undertaken projects like the A400M military transport aircraft that will fill some of the gaps in European medium-range transport capabilities. And we've also seen, under the auspices of the European Union, a number of low to medium intensity military operations, 25, 26 in total, which have demonstrated a growing capacity for the EU to begin to act as an autonomous security actor within its geopolitical neighbourhood. If we look at recent developments within the context of the Lisbon Treaty, we can also see some room for perhaps a more optimistic outlook for the capacity of the Europeans to get their act together in security. The Lisbon Treaty introduced the principle of permanent structured cooperation within the field of defence and security, which provides an opportunity for a core group of European states to push forward with deepening their cooperation in the area of security and defence. Following the Lisbon Treaty, we've also seen the establishment of the Ghent Framework, which is an initiative that tries to spur pooling and sharing in military capabilities and force generation. And if we look at the current challenges of the international system, we can see some very strong incentives for the Europeans to begin to get their act together in terms of providing for their own security through the EU. And this, in essence, is where the title of the presentation really comes through, the changing balance of power. You're all aware, I'm sure, that in recent years the United States has accelerated a process that's been present throughout the post-Cold War era, namely a repositioning of its strategic focus towards the Asia-Pacific region in the context of the rise of China. And this has very significant implications for the Europeans. It means a shift away from a focus on Europe and a real need for the Europeans to get their act together in providing for their own security and defence in the context of a United States that has increasingly its focus on other areas of the globe. The other aspect, the other contextual factor that I think provides a very strong impetus for European defence and that creates, I think, an imperative for European defence cooperation are the austerity measures that European governments have been subject to over recent years since the financial crisis. This means that the capacity of Britain, France, Germany, the West European great powers to deal with the US-Asia pivot on a unilateral basis is beginning to weaken. There's a need to pool and share capabilities. Otherwise, Europe will find itself marginalized in a world of growing powers in the context of the rise of the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, Russia, China. However, Europe has a big problem, a big collective action problem. It's highlighted by this cartoon with the poor little European piggy bank sitting atop a rather dilapidated tank. The Libya crisis demonstrated the extent to which European nations remain very heavily dependent on key strategic enablers from the United States in order to be able to undertake conflict within their geopolitical neighborhood. There were deficits in terms of C4ISR capabilities, command and control, communication, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. And even in areas like precision-guided munitions, the Europeans simply began to run out of these munitions during the conflict. In short, they wouldn't be able to undertake the conflict without the assistance of the United States. We also see in Europe a continued duplication of forces and capabilities. Europe is a very long way from beginning to pool and share capabilities in an effective manner. There's also a significant problem in terms of the way that the European defense market is very fragmented. It's unable to achieve the economies of scale that the US defense market can, which is dominated, of course, by three big players. If you look at Europe, it's highly fragmented. And this, of course, then leads to very wasteful expenditure in the area of defense, as nations duplicate very similar defense industrial tasks. Another thorn in the side of the European ability to develop military autonomy are the difficulties associated with cooperation between the Atlantic Alliance and the European Union. Now, these arise from difficulties between member states, in essence. So, of course, the continued problems that exist between Cyprus and Turkey, but in particular, disagreement between European states about the relative role that the United States and Europe should play in European security. And what I'm going to talk about in today's presentation are some of these problems and difficulties, about where they come from and how they've manifested themselves in terms of the differentiated Atlanticization and Europeanization of European defense policies that lead to this poor level of coordination between NATO and the European Union and a continued level of institutional competition. This, of course, then ties into the final problem associated with collective action in European defense, and that is, of course, the problem of crafting common European positions on key security challenges, something that was highlighted again very well by the Libya crisis, where Germany abstained from action, from military action, and significantly weakened the European position. So the question emerges of how these patterns of differentiation and convergence in European defense, this empirical picture that I've just painted, can be explained. And some of you, I suppose, will be aware. I mean, how many of you have studied the topic of European defense cooperation in any depth? Great. So I guess you'll be aware of some of the theoretical models that are associated with studying European defense. Could you perhaps give me any hints as to the kind of theoretical models that have been used to understand European defense?
But don't mind any of theoretical models. I think that maybe you can tell us.
Okay, happy to do so. Yep, sorry. Security regimes, yep, so more sort of liberal approaches to international relations that emphasize the development of trust and cooperation over time and their incremental learning processes about each other's intentions. Any other suggestions? Well, yes, I mean, the liberal perspective is one. There are other perspectives, such as classical realism and institutionalist theory that have been used in the context of European defense. But the main theoretical approach that's really dominated the literature is constructivism. And within Europe, well, within European academia in the present day, the constructivist position, at least in Western Europe, has taken on a level of dominance that was previously only attained by realist international relations theory during the 1970s and early 1980s. And it's this dominance of constructivist approaches to European defence, and I suppose, in a sense, implicitly, I'm challenging constructivism more generally in terms of explaining international outcomes, that I would like to engage with today. And what I want to do is bring back a focus on the impact of material power, on the insights of neo-realist international relations theory. But this isn't simply a restatement of the positions adopted by, the most prominent godfather of neo-realism, Kenneth Waltz. I want to look at the insights that the work of Stephen Walt can bring, and balance of threat theory, that I think provides a very useful framework for understanding what's been going on in European defence since the end of the Cold War. I'm going to argue that European states are engaging in a process of what I term reformed bandwagoning on the back of American power. During the Cold War, European states bandwagoned heavily on American power to deal with the threat that was posed by the Soviet Union. This, of course, has changed, and European states have undertaken a reform of this process of bandwagoning that I will discuss in more detail as we go into this into more depth in the lecture. I argue that differentiation in European defence is a product of variance in the external vulnerability of European states. And what I mean by that is variance in their geographical position and variance in their external resource dependency, the extent to which they are dependent on different areas of the globe to meet vital security interests and economic interests, particularly energy security, that have a central impact on their ability to wield power at the international level. In doing so, I will engage with cultural and constructivist approaches to international relations, but I'm going to argue that culture emerges as a secondary variable in understanding the process of defence cooperation. So I'm going to begin now by talking about constructivism in European defence, giving you a brief potted summary of the theoretical approach and how it's been applied to the area of European security and defence. And I'll then put forward my main thesis about European defence being a process of reformed bandwagoning on American power. The next section of the lecture then deals with explaining differentiation in European defence. And it looks, first of all, at the long-term implications of this variance in external vulnerability that European states have, in terms of the way that variance in external vulnerability creates particular ideological frameworks that are initially used as tools and resources by policymakers to justify the mobilization of society on behalf of these external challenges, but then begins to trap them over time, and they become hostage to. But I'll also look at the short-term implications of external vulnerability and the way it can have a very immediate impact on the policy positions that are adopted by European states in relation to key security challenges and to the role of EU and NATO in European security by looking at Libya as a case study. And I'll finish off with a brief discussion of the dialogue, the potential for dialogue between realists and cultural approaches. So I'm not shutting out the possibility that constructivism can have a role to play in understanding European security. So to begin with then, the concept of strategic culture and constructivist approaches to international relations. The fundamental assumption of constructivism is a notion that ideas matter, that we are driven not simply by material interests, but we're driven by, our interests are driven by our identities and our beliefs. And in the area of security and defense, this has taken the form of a literature that's known as the literature on strategic culture, which emphasizes the way that different nations' histories determine the way in which they perceive security challenges and the appropriate responses. And these national strategic cultures are then embedded within the broader society, but they're also institutionally embedded within the key institutions of defense and security policy within the state. And there are two main approaches to the concept of strategic culture. The work of Alistair Johnston from 1995 takes a fairly dogmatic approach to the role of strategic culture. It argues that it is the key independent variable in understanding defense and security policy. Culture goes all the way down. It informs most of our interests and our identities. But for Colin Gray, culture plays a slightly different role. It provides the context to understanding defense, but it doesn't explain everything. And it's Colin Gray's approach to strategic culture that I think perhaps has the strongest weight in terms of providing a capacity for realists to engage with, as I'll come on to later. Now, for the literature on European strategic culture then, CSDP, the Common Security and Defence Policy of the European Union, is a product of a range of different cultural factors. And these include societal learning from crises. They include similar threat assessments that have grown as a result of the development of what one might call epistemic communities in defence, communities of shared knowledge that grow and exist over time. You find the concept of epistemic communities used in a wide range of literatures. It's been used, for example, to understand the development of a consensus around global warming, for example, a coalition of NGOs and scientists who've all come together to form a very coherent shared body of knowledge. And similar processes, constructivists argue, are taking place in the context of defence and security, whereby policy elites begin then to converge around particular ideas of security threats and challenges. And one very, very, very important dynamic in all of this, and perhaps the central dynamic within the constructivist position on European defence, is the notion of elite socialization. Now, have any of you studied European integration theory? No? Okay. Well, in that case, you may not be familiar with it, but you may have heard of it. One of the theories of European integration is called neo-functionalism. It's a theory that argues that there is spillover between policy areas. So the European Union and its growth came about, the neo-functionalists argue, as a consequence of, first of all, a first step that was taken in defence with development, in cooperation with the development of the European coal and steel community. But this then had important implications because policy cooperation began to spill over into other policy areas. Once you had a coal and steel community, you needed to begin to integrate in other public policy areas. There was a logic to this integration process. And part of this spillover dynamic into other policy areas and the acceleration of cooperation was elite socialization. The notion that as policy actors come together in international institutions and organizations, so they begin to converge around similar ways of thinking about common problems. And this process of sort of ideational socialization that comes about is central to the literature on European strategic culture. It argues that the institutions that have been created provide a sort of mutually reinforcing dynamic to this process of cooperation. Now, in understanding differentiation in European defence, constructivists argue that we need to look to the way in which national strategic cultures remain quite rigid. So you have this general process of convergence that's taking place between elites as they begin to socialize with each other. But at the same time, you have a strong level of rigidity in terms of the way that the key principles of national strategic culture, the key beliefs about the role of a state in terms of its foreign policy and the role of force in foreign policy as a tool should be used. And we can draw out, I think, two broad assumptions of strategic culture in the area of European defence. The first assumption is the optimism that constructivists have about the ability of the state to overcome the competitive international system. The state has a high level of international agential power. It can act as an agent at this international level to create institutions that can overcome anarchy and mistrust. So we can move defence beyond the state. We can supranationalize it. We can move from cooperation in defence to possibly integration in defence. this spillover dynamic will eventually lead to significant integration. The other assumption is the one I've just talked about, that these institutions that are created foster these normative socialization processes over time. Well, I would argue that these two arguments of the constructivists don't really stand up to scrutiny. Because when we look at the empirical evidence of European defence, we can see that it remains highly intergovernmental. The supranational institutions that have been created in European defence have little power to steer national defence policies. And if anything, all that's happened is that national power has been reconstituted at this international level. It's still the national country ambassadors within the Political and Security Committee that are key in terms of deciding and determining the direction of CSDP. Even the constructivists in their literature will admit this. Secondly, it's very difficult to prove that interest formation in defence is a product of identity, that it's a product of these processes of elite socialization driving European convergence. And furthermore, my perhaps strongest criticism of the constructivist literature, as you'll see from this rather crude picture, I would never have put this picture up if I was actually lecturing to a constructivist audience, because they would have murdered me. I gave this presentation in San Francisco at the International Studies Association on a panel that was called Advancing Strategic Culture. You can see I probably toned it down for them a little bit. But the constructivists have failed to engage with the insights of a neo-realist approach. I argue that they've painted a picture of neo-realist theory that is misleading and incorrect. They failed to read their theory properly. They do not know their enemy. The literature on strategic culture in the context of European defence doesn't engage with the full range of responses that European states can have to a unipolar international system, to one that is dominated by the power of the United States. There are a range of possible responses that states can have within the context of unipolarity. These include balancing, the notion that what European states are doing with the European Union is engaging in a process of balancing against the United States. That the European Union's common security and defence policy is a process of developing an informal military alliance against the US that one day will become more formal. In the context of a United States that's striving for global hegemony, that's acting according to the dictates of offensive unipolarity. In order to provide its security, the only way it can do so is to continually expand. And one day, the neo-realists argue, or some of the neo-realists argue, the United States will inevitably become a threat to Europe. And that's why the Europeans are developing their security and defence policy. Now, I argue that this argument doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that European states are balancing against the US. But this is pretty much the only argument that the constructivists actually engage with, if at all. And they paint neo-realism as this straw man, as a fake enemy, an enemy they don't really understand, that can be easily knocked down. And then constructivism can fill its place very neatly. And you can see this from this quotation. I don't know if any of you heard of Thomas Riese. He's an academic at the Freie Universität in Berlin, very prominent thinker on the European Union more generally, one of the top professors in Europe, who's also written on European defence and foreign and security policy. And you can see from his quotation the limited understanding of neo-realism that infuses his work, namely that balancing is the standard behaviour of nation states. Well, I would argue that neo-realism is in fact a much richer theory than the constructivists allow for, and it provides a great degree of purchase in understanding outcomes in European defence. Please. Yeah, go for it.
It seems that Europe and USA, they're not enemies, right? but what Europe perceived to be possible threats. I mean, what exactly? What countries or maybe what types of politics may be regarded as a threat for European Union?
Well, I'm going to come on to this in a moment. So if you're patient, I will deal with this question as the argument builds. So if you hold your horses, hopefully I will answer your question in a moment. What I'd like to begin, like to turn to now, though, is the insights of neorealism in terms of understanding European defence. As you know, neorealism derives from the work of Kenneth Waltz, and Kenneth Waltz argued that cooperation and conflict in the international system is a result of the distribution of material capabilities in the international system, the balance of power. This drives all international outcomes ultimately. Now, at the core of neorealism is the assumption that the international system is anarchic, that there's a high degree of uncertainty about the intentions of other states in the international system. We cannot be sure what other states are planning and intending, and therefore we have to prepare for the worst. And this, of course, then leads to a very intense security dilemma between states and a high level of mistrust and competition. But the international system isn't characterized by a constant state of pure war, though there are periods of relative peace in the international system and periods of relatively intense conflict, as we've seen throughout the 20th century. And the neo-realists explain this by saying, well, it's down to the balance of power, the distribution of power at any particular moment. So where you have a multipolar international system, for example, one characterized by the presence of 3 or more competing powers, as we could potentially be moving to in today's international system, there is, according to the neo-realists, a very strong potential for conflict, because quite a few states have the capacity to strive for global hegemony. And this, of course, then is the reason why neo-realists argue the First and Second World Wars broke out, because of the presence of multipolarity. But a bipolar or unipolar international system is more stable, because of the capacity of 2 states or 1 state to manage the balance of power. And what we see at present in the international system is one that's characterized still by unipolarity, the military and economic dominance, particularly military dominance, of the United States, that allows for a significant measure of stability. And of course, Europe is under the shield of the Americans. The one defining feature that you could argue has stopped conflict breaking out in Europe after the Second World War has been the American security umbrella. America has sat on top of Europe like a pacifier, stop European nations competing and fighting. And within this context, this unipolar international system, there are 2 possible responses. As I've mentioned, European states could begin to balance against the United States, a potential threat. Or they could bandwagon on the back of American power. But bandwagoning brings problems, and it brings problems for neo-realism. Because if you look at neo-realism and the position that's adopted by Kenneth Waltz, states are primed to expand. So if you bandwagon on the back of American power, you're exacerbating the problem. Unipolarity will eventually lead to conflict, because that state will want to strive, the United States will want to strive for global dominance. It's the only way to achieve security in this competitive international system. And indeed, if we look at the actions of the United States throughout the post-Cold War period, there are some very strong indications that the United States has been acting in this manner, according to the dictates of offensive unipolarity, expanding its power in various regions of the globe in order to guarantee its security. So from this perspective, bandwagoning on the back of American power is the wrong strategy, because you're simply engaging in appeasement of a state that will one day become your enemy. However, there's another way of looking at this, and this is where Stephen Waltz's balance of threat comes in. And it makes perfect sense to me that states don't simply balance against capabilities. They don't simply look at the state with the greatest capabilities in the international system and say, that's my enemy. They balance against the state that is the most threatening. And where you have a state that is closer, that has more offensive capabilities than the unipolar leader, than the United States, that's going to be much more of a threat to you than the United States. I mean, it's a similar analogy to, you know, if there's a large Rottweiler on an island offshore that's barking at me, I'm not going to care because it's miles away. Whereas if there's a small Jack Russell Terrier that's snapping at my feet and trying to bite my ankles, that's more of a threat and a problem to me, even though it's smaller. And this, I mean, it's common sense, in essence. And this is where I think the balance of threat comes in quite strongly in terms of explaining European defence. Because what European states are doing is they're bandwagoning on the back of American power for profit, to gain from the spoils of American victory, and the spoils of war. The European Union and the United States share, most importantly, and this is where we come back to the point raised by the gentleman over here in the, well, your right, my left, hand corner of the room, share a number of common security concerns. These include the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, dealing with states like Iran, North Korea, and so on. Failed states, international terrorism, managing rising powers in the international system, the BRIC countries, and they also share the problem, well, to some extent, of the problem of peak oil and managing access to mineral resources. Now, there has been some attention given of late to the way in which America may become energy self-sufficient over the next few years as a consequence of new methods of extracting oil and gas. But nevertheless, this does remain a significant security challenge. I'm not so sure about the extent to which these new methods of energy extraction are necessarily going to deliver. They necessitate, of course, a great deal of energy expenditure themselves. And explaining why the United States has engaged itself so heavily in the Middle East over the last few years and given so much, expended so much of its resources and lives in the Middle East, I think can't be done without recourse to looking at energy security. And in the context of these common security concerns, I argue then that European states are in this process of reformed bandwagoning. They're reforming their process of bandwagoning on American power. They're doing this by dealing with two problems. The threat of abandonment by the United States, that they're trying to hedge against by contributing to NATO, contributing to US operations in Afghanistan, and helping to strengthen NATO through initiatives like the NATO Response Force. And this, of course, allows European states a greater level of leverage over the unipolar leader, whilst at the same time dealing with the problem of entrapment and entanglement within American security policy and American strategic goals, by developing the European Union's common security and defence policy that can provide a mechanism for the Europeans to engage with problems within their geopolitical neighbourhood when America isn't interested in helping out. And this process of reformed bandwagoning, I think we can see quite clearly when we look at the empirical picture of European defence and the convergence that's taken place in European defence policies and their position vis-à-vis NATO and the European Union, their relative Atlanticization or Europeanization over the post-Cold War period. What we see when we look, for example, at French defence policy is over time an incrementally greater Atlanticization of French defence. Of course, we saw in 2009 the integration of France back into NATO's integrated military command structures, which was a very important step in terms of the Atlanticization of French defence policy. But this is a process that's gone back over time for a long period. It has its roots back in the operations that were taking place in Bosnia and the realization that France was beginning to commit a great deal to NATO without getting much back in terms of influence within the organization. Of course, France was at one point the fourth largest contributor to the ISAF operation in Afghanistan. That said, France remains quite strongly Europeanized, quite strongly in favor of European solutions to military problems. And I'm going to come on to that sort of nuanced differentiation in a moment and explaining that. when we look at British defence policy, over the post-Cold War period, despite Britain's rather negative role in the European Union at present, I would argue we see an incremental Europeanisation and shift towards being more in favour of European military autonomy. And one can see this, for example, in the way that Britain took a lead role in the St. Malo initiative under Tony Blair in the late 1990s that actually initiated CSDP in tandem with France. Britain was also a central actor in the 2004 Battle Group initiative that began to establish harder military capabilities that would allow the Europeans to at least undertake initial entry operations within their geopolitical neighbourhood. But of course, Britain remains sceptical of any European defence initiatives that might fundamentally challenge the central role of NATO, so opposed to initiatives like the development of an independent, autonomous European operational headquarters that might begin to undermine shape with NATO. Germany, one could argue, has remained relatively stable in terms of its position on Atlanticization and Europeanization, in the sense that it tries to adopt a bridge role between the British and the French positions. But it has, of late, been more willing to adopt unilateral positions on defence and security issues, particularly in relation to Libya. There is another factor as well that I think briefly deserves mention from the neo-realist angle that helps us explain the acceleration of cooperation in Europe after 1999. Now, if you'll recall, one of the key dynamics that's given weight within the constructivist literature is this principle of elite socialization. That is, in a sense, the driver of the acceleration of cooperation. As elites come together over time, they begin to develop common norms and shared practices. But I would argue that actually the real driver of the acceleration of cooperation is a process of military isomorphism in post-Cold War Europe. As European states, and this goes back to the original research I was talking about when I was on my Humboldt fellowships, European states have begun to converge around a common model of military best practice, a partial and selective emulation of the capabilities and doctrines and force structures that have underpinned the US-led revolution in military affairs. And this model of military best practice that has emerged has acted as a foundation for European states to then begin to engage in cross-national capability procurement projects. If you don't know what kind of war you're going to fight, and you don't know what kind of model of military best practice you need to follow, it's very difficult to undertake cross-national procurement projects. So from a neo-realist angle, it's actually the socialization pressures of the competitive international system that are at work, not the socialization pressures that come out of, meetings of officials within international institutions. Now, all this talk about convergence is well and good, but the practice of European defence, of course, is characterised by a high level of differentiation still between European states. A lot of disagreement about the extent to which European states should worry about abandonment or entrapment by the United States. And we see in Europe a relatively strongly Atlanticized, despite its incremental Europeanization, a relatively strongly Atlanticized defense policy of Britain, and France more Europeanized. Where does this come from? Well, I would argue that this Atlanticization and Europeanization is a consequence of a long-term impact of variance in external vulnerability of European states. That divergence in geographical position and divergence in external resource dependencies of European states has created a context within which policy leaders were incentivized to use nationalism, culture, and ideology on behalf of meeting these challenges. But these ideologies, they've almost become hostage to. And I'm going to briefly talk about the British, French, and German examples now to illustrate the point that I'm making. If we look at France, we can see that really it was under de Gaulle in the late 1960s that France took a step away from NATO to a policy of semi-detachment from NATO. It withdrew from NATO's integrated military command structures. But this was semi-detachment. This wasn't full withdrawal. France signed a number of military agreements that stipulated that they would come to the aid of Britain and Germany and other states in Europe in the context of an attack by the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact states. And this position from France was driven to some extent by some contextual factors in this period of history. The realization by de Gaulle that France, in the context of the Vietnam War, risked being drawn into a set of conflicts that risked nuclear war by following American strategic ambitions, but were of relatively little importance to France and to Europe. But there were some broader, deeper factors at play here in terms of France's semi-detachment from NATO that set the scene then for this strongly independent position adopted by France in European security. And this relates to, first of all, geographical position. France was very distrustful of the Anglo-Saxon security guarantee. The experience of the First and Second World War had taught the French that the Anglo-Saxons were quite perfidious when it came to guaranteeing French security. So it was very sensible for the French to try to become the predominant military power in Europe and try to decouple themselves to some extent from NATO. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, the legacy of empire. France underwent a very difficult and drawn-out process of decolonization after the end of the Second World War. And one of the main reasons why the French process of decolonization was so drawn out was because of the extent to which France was very heavily dependent upon its colonies and some former colonies for key mineral resources. If we look at France's France's energy sector, its generation of electricity, France is reliant, I think, for about 77% of its electricity on nuclear power. And the uranium that fueled that nuclear power during the 1980s and early 1990s, around 36% of that came from Niger and Gabon, two states in Africa, which led to a very close preoccupation by the French for exerting power within their former colonial environment. And it led de Gaulle and French policymakers into a significant level of contestation with the United States, because the US was, of course, formally opposed to overt empire, although anybody who's studied the actions of the United States in the Caribbean and Latin America will laugh long and hard about that. And what we see then in France is the use of nationalism and ideology and culture as rhetorical tools to justify this independent position. And this is something that, to some extent, French policymakers became hostage to over time. And I argue this ideology began as something that was being used as a tool by policymakers. It grew into something that they became hostage to. And we can see that also very clearly in the British case. For the British in the post-war environment after the Second World War, they faced a very different context to the French. Whilst they were in a similar sort of geographical position in Europe, the balance of threat was completely different. For the British to exert influence in key areas of the globe that were central to their security interests, getting on side with the Americans was essential. I'm talking here about the Middle East, where between 56 and 80% of British oil came from between the period of the end of the Second World War and 1980, when we discovered oil in the North Sea in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so Britain, realized that siding with the Americans made a great deal of sense for their security interests. This then led to a path dependency. The British over time became very heavily dependent on military technology transfers, particularly in the area of nuclear weapons, but in other areas, in intelligence as well, from the United States. And allied to that was the development of a discourse of this special relationship between Britain and the United States that one could argue to some extent now has taken over, particularly the Conservative Party in Britain. And this ideology of the special relationship and of the importance of America to Britain's security interests is beginning to cloud an objective understanding and view of our real security interests, which are collaboration with our European partners through the EU, with the United States looking at very different parts of the globe. Now, for Germany, we see this bridge role between the EU and NATO very much a consequence of their strategic situation at the end of the Second World War, the need to balance French and American concerns in defense and security. Post-war chancellors, Adenauer in particular, was preoccupied with two issues. The first issue was ensuring a security guarantee for Germany that was very vulnerable in the context of Soviet power to the east. But also, he was preoccupied with German reunification and ensuring that that Germany would have Russian, American, French, and British support for the reunification of East and West Germany as and when it would take place. And these policy goals then necessitated the development of a policy discourse that emphasized the non-threatening role of Germany. Germany would have got nowhere in its relations with its partners if it had pursued a policy that was based on the use of force, or the threat of the use of force. So emphasizing Germany's anti-militarism had a very strong strategic rationale, as well as, of course, a domestic rationale. It was about the moral and political rehabilitation of Germany in the international community so that it could achieve its goals, its broader strategic goals. We also must remember that during this time, Germany was a semi-sovereign state. For much of this period, it was occupied by the Allied powers. So it had very little capacity to draw resources from domestic society on behalf, anyway, of a more aggressive and assertive defense and security policy. Now, that, in essence, I think, is how we see the long-term implications of variance and external vulnerability playing out, in terms of the way that policymakers become hostage to the ideologies that were once instrumental and then begin to drive policy. But variance and external vulnerability can also have a very important short-term implication, as we'll see in the context of this case study on Libya. You see a cartoon of our wonderful leader, David Cameron, with Sarkozy. It makes you wonder what Carla Bruni ever saw in the chat, but there you go. Now, I think Libya for many of the constructivists, Libya is talked about as an example, a prime example, of the insights of strategic culture. They say that German non-participation in Libya is a direct consequence of its culture of anti-militarism, its reticence to use force as a tool in foreign policy that derive from deeply held beliefs and ideas that are a consequence of the Second World War. However, I would challenge this and argue that it's actually variance and external vulnerability that explains German non-participation and therefore the weakening of the European Union's stance in dealing with Libya as a security problem. If we look at the politics of oil in Europe and its resource dependency, one can see very clearly that the British and French have spent the last few years courting Libya. This is very clear in the relationship between Tony Blair and Colonel Gaddafi. And when an opportunity came up for the British and French to overthrow Gaddafi and install perhaps a more favorable regime, when the Gaddafi regime really looked like it was going to fall, they of course needed to curry favor with the opposition movement. And action in Libya has given these two states access to 3.6% of the world's remaining global oil supplies, proven supplies, and very good quality crude oil this is. And we must bear in mind that European states are facing something of a crisis in terms of their access to oil supplies over the next few years, as North Sea oil begins to dissipate and run out Most of British oil comes from its own suppliers and from Norway, but this is changing and very rapidly. So Libya is on Europe's doorstep. It provides an excellent source of oil that can be transported quite easily to Europe. But for Germany, there's a very different rationale that play a very different set of external resource dependencies in the area of energy security. You can see up here in the top right-hand corner of the slide a diagram which there's a big circle. That is the area that the Bundeswehr Transformation Center, big think tank in German military affairs that's part of the defense ministry in Germany, identified as central to German energy requirements over the next few years. It involves the Caucasus and the Middle East. And of course, Germany has been focusing very heavily on Eurasia as its source of energy over the next few decades. And there simply wasn't a strategic rationale for the Germans to get involved in Libya. They didn't have any key interests there. And that's why they didn't get involved. And all this talk about, the German culture of anti-militarism is something that's used, I argue, by German policy elites to justify and legitimate their non-participation in alliance operations, under burden sharing in NATO and CSDP, to this international audience. So they say, well, look, Angela Merkel will say, my hands are tied. Public opinion's dead against us participating. And we have this very difficult history, I'm sorry, we can't participate. Well, I think this position, the position I'm adopting here is, and this, my arguments here are coming from research that I've undertaken in Germany. And one of my sources, senior ranking official within the German Foreign Office, made a statement that I think sums this up very neatly. The lack of substantial German interests in Libya made it much easier for Guido Westerwelle, the German foreign minister, to adopt an anti-war position. So the real drivers of German policy are the same as the British and French. They have a similar realist calculus going on. It's just that this differentiation in external vulnerability creates a context in which there's really very little incentive for the Germans to get involved. So I'd like to finish off by returning to the sort of theoretical dimension of the presentation. I don't want to come across as a massive constructivist cultural basher. Yes, I am a neo-realist, but I think that if we're going to be able to understand the nuances and intricacies of international relations, then we need to engage in dialogue between different theoretical approaches. And what I would argue in this presentation is that yes, neo-realism provides a very substantial measure of leverage in terms of understanding the bigger outcomes in European security, in terms of European convergence, and also in terms of understanding these elements of differentiation in Europeanization and Atlanticization. Culture emerges as an intervening variable. It's a variable that slows down or speeds up the pace at which European states are converging with the incentives of the balance of threat. And this echoes, I think, the insights of the neoclassical realist literature. So I return back to neoclassical realism. And the notion that, as Brian Rathburn noted in his article in Security Studies in 2008, within realist theory, states are free to, in effect, commit suicide. They are free to make choices about their broader strategic goals that are based on ideology, that are based on nationalism. Ultimately, this will lead to a loss of relative power. And of course, if it does, then that proves neo-realism correct. So culture can be a factor, but it's wrong for leaders to follow culture and nationalism as their goal of policy and as a driver of policy. They should be following the dictates of the balance of threat. But some questions emerge that neo-realism cannot answer. And this is where dialogue between cultural and realist approaches come in. One question, for example, why is it that France was able to overcome, that President Sarkozy was able to overcome the constraints of Gaullist ideology in 2009 and reintegrate France into NATO's command structures? Why was he able to do that so effectively and so quickly, when in Britain, David Cameron remains totally hamstrung by the Eurosceptic backbench of the Conservative Party in following the imperative of European defence cooperation? And this takes us into the territory of understanding the impact of individuals on history. Of course, a very fraught subject, very difficult to really understand when individuals impact history. But I think they can do. And it's a concern that realists have, that classical realists have, but it's also a concern that's shared by constructivists. A lot of the strategic culture literature tries to understand this interaction and interplay between structure and agency, the extent to which, political leaders can act to reshape the discourses that surround defence and security. Classical realists also try to understand the impact of individual leaders on reshaping nationalism and ideology. It's just that the constructivists believe that this ideology is causal, whereas, of course, the realists would argue it's more instrumental. But I think there's potential for dialogue there. There's also a potential for work in terms of understanding how, at the domestic level, the differentiation in things like the institutional structure of the state has an impact on the capacity of political leaders to deploy culture, nationalism, and ideology as a tool. And I take the German example as one that illustrates this. In Germany, one could argue very low executive autonomy in defence. The core executive, defence ministry, the chancellor, their scope for manoeuvre in changing defence policy and in fundamentally altering the ideologies that have grown over time of anti-militarism and the culture of restraint in German foreign policy. These are limited to some extent by the structure of the state. The way in Germany you have very frequent elections at the land level, at the regional level, that have big implications for the capacity of the governing coalition at the federal level to push their political agenda through the Bundestag. And this creates a higher level of sensitivity to public opinion. We have regular important elections. There's no big window of opportunity to do what Sarkozy did in 2009 and say, right, we're Atlanticizing our defense and security policy. In Germany, that big window of opportunity, Sarkozy didn't really have to look to another election for quite a long time. Because the regional elections in France, unless you're under cohabitation, don't really matter so much. So the impact of these sort of domestic variables can also be important. The other issue that I think is worthy of further scholarship and work in this area is the strategic use of culture in the process of intra-alliance bargaining. I mentioned earlier on how Germany has used its culture of anti-militarism as a tool with which to excuse itself from participating in military operations that aren't necessarily central to its interests. And how culture is used by leaders to engage with their opposite numbers in other national capitals, I think is something that's not really been looked at in depth in the literature, and certainly is in need of more investigation. So, in essence then, I'm arguing for greater scholarship in this area in terms of work between the more moderate constructivist position and realist thinkers. And I think that work in the area of security and defence will give us a much greater level of understanding about the factors that are holding the Europeans back from the imperative of European defence cooperation in the context of the Asia pivot and in the context of austerity measures. I guess I'll leave it there because I've spoken for about an hour. But thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions you may have. Please.
Thank you very much for your lecture. And I have a question. During the last decade, we have witnessed the transformation of NATO, and it is assuming the role of a global security organization. So, and my question is, What do you think will be its role in Europe in the near future?
NATO's role in Europe. Well, I think that the fundamental job that NATO does, and this shouldn't be underestimated, is, as I mentioned earlier on, it is the US pacifier of Europe. It stops conflict from breaking out between the West European great powers. It stops the emergence of balancing behavior within a continent we mustn't forget has been ravaged by war over the last century. And I suppose its first and foremost role really is that of stabilizing the European balance of power. It's one that's been forgotten about over the last few years because we take that balance of power for granted. We take the American security guarantee for granted. And we forget, in a way, the dynamics, I think the more long-term dynamics of international relations. We've existed in the context of a unipolar and a bipolar international system for such a long period of time. We forget that actually, if we have the context of multipolarity, at a regional level that's not under the dominance of one state, it could eventually lead to conflict. So I think for that reason NATO will persist, and the Americans, I think, know very well that they're very well aware of this function that NATO plays. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why the Germans get away with so much within NATO, with under-burden sharing. Because they know, really, whatever happens, the US nuclear umbrella and the security guarantee that the Americans provide in terms of managing the European balance of power isn't going to go, because it's in America's interests to keep that balance of power. But of course, NATO faces European states face a range of other challenges as well. And much will depend on the extent to which, in the context of, I suppose, the balance of threat, European states and American interests coincide in dealing with certain security challenges. We've seen a good deal of differentiation in Europe, for example, in relation to how to deal with international terrorism. And now the United States is moving towards a context where it's increasingly relying on extrajudicial killings, on the use of drones, targeted assassinations. The extent to which European states are going to be willing to move forward in support of American policy that uses such techniques, I think will test the Atlantic Alliance to a great extent. And of course, there's a range of other security challenges. And of course, as well, the kind of desire and hunger and willingness to undertake these large-scale expeditionary operations is certainly going to dissipate now in the context of a drawback in Afghanistan. So NATO's future, I suppose, in terms of new security challenges, uncertain, but in terms of its more traditional role, I actually think it will certainly sustain itself in that area. It's easily forgotten about.
Well, I have a strange example. Have you seen the Star Wars movies, right?
A long time ago.
Well, there is a Republic, and there is a Jedi Council. So I think here it describes the situation, I suppose, very properly. For example, the Chancellor of the Republic. So during the war, he's been empowered. He's because the Republic is at war with words doesn't matter. Well, so it's the United States, and the Jedi Council, I suppose, is like the European Union and the Europe. So it's the Chancellor is being empowered, and in the end, it comes to the situation where when the Jedi realize what is really happening, they can't really do anything because the Chancellor has already as much power. He orders to execute the Order 66. So now most part of Europe is in NATO. And if then they will try to stop the process of bandwagoning, can the United States say that they are doing something illegal? They are behaving against the laws of NATO, and say that they are bad or illegal?
I think that I suppose really at the core of your question is the extent to which the United States approves of the...
Make it unstoppable.
Well, I suppose, first of all, I would say that the United States has changed its position quite significantly over the last few years in relation to the extent to which it is happy for the Europeans to move forward with developing greater autonomy. Because, I mean, this isn't a question that I dealt with in my presentation, but there is a good degree of complementarity, nevertheless, between NATO and CSDP. I mean, you've got to remember that the armed forces on which NATO is calling and the European Union is calling are the same, you know. So if the European Union is able to strengthen Europe's military capabilities through pooling and sharing initiatives, these are capabilities that could just as easily be used in the alliance context as well. So for the United States, I think there is a sense of them being much more willing to allow the Europeans more freedom to develop military autonomy. And another feature, of course, in this is the way that the Americans move towards this more acquiescent position in relation to CSDP in the context of France's reintegration to NATO's military command structures. And that, for the Americans, was a very clear signal. So they thought that the French were moving away from trying to develop military autonomy per se towards a more cooperative relationship between NATO and the European Union. Now, whether that's going to play out over time, the way the Americans think, I'm not necessarily so sure, particularly under the Hollande administration. But I don't think the Americans are necessarily, as anti-CSDP as perhaps you may have suggested in your question. So, in a sense as well, when it comes to the question of is this process stoppable, my argument would be, well, structure always wins out. The forces of history are usually big structural forces that individuals have very little capacity to overcome. And that goes back to, great Karl Marx, who, famously stated, to paraphrase Marx, man or woman makes history, but not necessarily in circumstances of his or her own choosing. And so it is with security and defense policy. It happens, and it happens as a result of these big forces, of a distribution of capabilities and a balance of threat. And in a way, these forces are unstoppable. These are the forces of history. The individuals, I suppose, it's like individuals are the voices shouting within the roar of this structure that's pushing them. So, I wonder sometimes how much can really be stopped. But then I sometimes start thinking if this is a very good analogy for the whole of life, It works this way. Anyway, thank you for your question. It was very interesting. I hope I managed to answer it in some way. It was an interesting analogy to draw. We'll take a question at the front and then further back. So I don't know who's been waiting the longest. So, okay, you have to wait, I'm afraid.
Thank you for your lecture. And speaking about new member countries of European Union, how do you think, what are the perspectives of their contribution and integration in European defense policy?
It's an interesting question. It's one that has seen actually quite a degree of scholarship over the last few years. And one of the interesting dynamics that's taking place is the way in which many of the former Warsaw Pact states that joined NATO were initially extremely skeptical of CSDP, of the European Union's defense policy, because they didn't want to do anything that undermined NATO. They still feared Russia, and they felt very vulnerable. So they were very, very highly Atlanticized. That has begun to change over time, and I think it's changed as a result of the United States being, more in favor of European defense initiatives, as they've come to see the complementarity between CSDP and NATO. And you've seen, European states like the Polish, for example, have begun to take a very important lead role within the European Union's battle groups and in developing capabilities. And really, the role of these states is to provide niche capabilities. It's to develop role specialization within particular areas that they can then contribute to multinational operations. So, obviously their defense industrial base and their military capacity isn't such that they're able to provide broad spectrum capabilities, but they can provide key niche capabilities, which could be very important within military operations. So on the EU side, I think we see a growing Europeanization of these states. And that really is simply in line with the changing strategic imperatives. Again, it's structure winning out. But I still think that NATO is centrally important for these states.
Okay, and I like very much your cultural dimension. Maybe you can give some comments about new countries and cultural dimension in this slide.
In relation to strategic culture, you mean? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point, really. I mean, much of the analysis that I've made has been biased towards looking at, the big powers, Britain, France, and Germany. And I suppose, in a way, that's a consequence of the substantial role that these states play. But smaller states also can have an important influence. And I mean, we were talking earlier on about regime theory in the context of European defence, and there are a number. There's a scholar called Anand Menon who's based at King's College, London, and he adopts an institutionalist approach to European defence, where he argues that the smaller states have actually had a disproportionate level of influence over agenda setting on European defence, on the direction of CSDP, and it's, I suppose, to some extent, their policy is driven by embedded strategic culture. I mean, one cannot deny the impact that, for Poland, for example, successive invasions by the Germans and the Russians have had on Polish strategic culture. It's created, I suppose, a high level of fear of their external environment and the perception that they're in a very highly threatening environment. But of course, as a realist, I would say, well, that's not really culture. That is a product of their geographical position and their unfortunate geographical position. And really, what they've learned is not anything to do with culture. They have just simply learned to be Poland in this geographical position, sandwiched between these major powers. It's dangerous, and it is dangerous. And that's down to the distribution of capabilities within their geopolitical neighborhood. So I suppose in a way you could say, well, is it strategic culture or is it just sensible policy making? So I suppose I'd be a bit more skeptical about the role of culture in driving their defense and security policies. Oh, there was a question at the front, wasn't there? Sorry.
Thank you for your lecture. I'd like to ask you one question. I'd like to know your opinion. What do you think? What if the transatlantic approach to European defense and security is a strategic mistake of European Union? I mean that Russia is always expelled from this process. Since 1991, this question is almost frozen. We are worrying about human rights, and we have some success in anti-terroristic programs, but that is all. We still have no common strategic idea. Don't you think that strategically it's more important for European Union to see European defense as Eurasian defense? What do you think about this?
I think that's a very, very good point. The relationship between Russia and NATO and the relationship between Russia and the European Union and the security defense dimension is, relegated really to fora like, for example, the Partnership for Peace, and the level of cooperation is pretty weak. And I suppose a lot of this comes down to, again, differentiation in the external vulnerability of European states and differentiation in strategic priorities between European states and Russia. I mean, if you look at Britain and Russia and Germany and Russia, two very different contexts. And Germany, by virtue of its geographical position, has, going back through history, has always focused on Eurasia. For Hitler, Eurasia was the Lebensraum for Germany. It was the area into which Germany was going to expand to get its natural resources from, to make up for its iron ore shortages and its other shortages in natural materials as well as manpower for its population. And of course, through to the present day, we see the carving out by the Schröder administration and under Merkel's continued high levels of resource dependency on Russia, which create a very particular relationship between Germany and Russia. We've seen this, of course, embodied within the visit from Vladimir Putin to Angela Merkel just recently. Of course, Britain, on the other hand, has a very different relationship with Russia, and the material dynamics of the relationship are different. And this makes crafting common policy positions within the context of the European Union very difficult. And of course, you've also got the kind of, if you look more broadly at the way in which, and this actually does take us back to culture, the way in which certain stereotypes about nations are pervaded. I mean, we go back to, and I'm not thinking necessarily about Britain here, but the United States and the recent elections. And we had Romney there, perhaps not the best informed politician, but then how many are in America, who was arguing that Russia was actually the United States' greatest geopolitical foe, which of course is, I think, complete foolishness. And it's probably a jolly good thing he didn't get elected. But you could see there how ideology can lead to quite strange policy statements. Now, whether that would have actually persisted in power, I seriously doubt as a position. But you can see then that also, I think, plays out in the European dynamic. You have these certain understandings of relations with nations that go back over time and are embedded within the policy-making community more generally. And I guess they can have an impact, and in that sense, cultural variables can come into play. But yeah, I certainly think there's probably scope for greater cooperation between Russia and European states, but identifying the common areas that European states can agree on is a difficult problem. I think Russia would be quite ready, but it's a more cohesive unit. But.
Well, what about power projection? I mean, in general, the concept proposed by Minister Chizhov in the EU, when they discussed with European ministers the concept of pooling and sharing and possible Russian participation in this concept, actually, because what exactly Europeans do share with themselves, if nothing to share, but Russia may contribute a lot, actually. Well, in terms of transport, airlift, and so on and so forth, and the joint project that were actually suspended for some time, and that's because the Europeans were not in favor of this project. I mean, they were not in favor of Antonov. They decided to develop their own transport aircraft, A400, and we know what happened then. They are still don't have it actually.
Still leasing the.
Well, that's one of the common area for cooperation. Actually, joint projection for out of area operations outside Europe actually. So I agree with that question. That's really very good question. Reorienting Europe towards Eurasian integration. I mean, because if we take your analytical framework, the neoclassical realism, which perceives states as black boxes, so putting aside ideology, human rights, and so on and so forth. So that makes really clear guidance for cooperation with Russia, actually. Because if we put aside all the sensitive issues and just cooperate on power, that means that neoclassical realism make a good foundation for that, actually. So, really good question. And actually, the United States, will be in favor actually of this cooperation because, if to take into consideration that use decline, I mean, relative decline towards the other centers of power now, emerging multipolarity, new kind of multipolarity, and use declinism and use dependence on other centers of power and the aspiration of the United States to share its burden with other centers of power, with Europe, with China, for some extent, with India, with Russia. I mean, well, and I think that actually what we witness now, actually, the policy of reset, actually, what the United States do, actually, they don't have any, they don't make any obstacles for EU-Russia cooperation, but actually even in military sphere. But the question is a sense of political will on behalf of Europeans that some of them are really afraid of this cooperation, actually. And if we take into consideration these areas of cooperation, these so-called roadmaps agreed with Russia, agreed by Europeans and Russians in 2005, actually, the most underdeveloped dimension is common security, external security, because economic cooperation is quite good, actually, but the most underdeveloped is actually this dimension. I mean, security, external security, actually. So there's a good field for cooperation, actually. It exists, actually. If we take intergovernmental level, according to realist approach, I mean, that politics made by states, but not supranational structures, actually. But they are marginal.
Of course, but the neo-realists would argue that one of the big problems and impediments to cooperation is the alliance security dilemma, and the extent to which you can never be sure that your alliance partner is going to contribute capabilities. And so that acts, one could argue, as a kind of brake on defense cooperation. And where you have, states in the international system that are in very different geographical contexts with very different threat environments, one could argue, I suppose, that there is a risk that European states might identify that Russia may have some quite divergent interests, so there may be cases where the Russians will not be willing to provide capabilities that they might in other contexts. So maybe this alliance security dilemma acts as a kind of break.
Because we may witness this is some kind of overcoming this security dilemma since mid-90s, actually. I mean, institutionalizing the link between Russia and NATO, actually. And so this process should be fostered. And in Russia, 2-3 years ago, there was a wide political discourse on that issue. I mean, deep integration in Russia with NATO, actually, and as well as Euro-Atlantic integration in general, actually. So it could be overcome, actually, because there are strategic purposes and there are common strategic interests that could merge this greater alliance. Actually, there is a foundation for cooperation, because this is actually the atavism of the Cold War, actually, I mean, the security dilemma. Well, it does not correspond to real national interest, neither of Russia, nor the United States, nor European countries. Well, when we're dealing with common threats of Eurasia, terrorism, Afghanistan, weapons of mass destruction, and so on and so forth.
I think on these issues there is plenty of room for cooperation. I absolutely agree.
Well, and actually Russia contributed a lot. I mean, in this Eurasian security for the United States and for NATO in general. I mean, so actually, what we witnessed for this decade, Russia provided transport roads to Afghanistan, and well, actually, Russia is one of the main contributors to this operation. I mean, indirectly, not in terms of material contributions, but in terms of logistics, actually. Well, no one argues it. It is even more, to some extent, it is even more reliable partner for the United States than, for example, Estonia or Lithuania or these newly Atlanticist countries.
An area that has traditionally fallen into Russia's sphere of influence. And, yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but maybe we can stop here. It's not too late.
Thank you all for your attention today.